Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Every year on the 26th of January, millions of Aussies take to the pubs, streets and beaches to commemorate Australia Day.
Arms!
On Australia Day, we come together and celebrate our nation and all of our history.
They drink beer, enjoy Barbies and take pride in their country, its culture and achievements.
It's to celebrate everything that's good about Australia, the weather, family, friends.
It's safe, it's fun, it's Australia, it's what we do.
But of late, Australia Day elicits just as much, if not more, protest and controversy than celebration.
It's a day that's, steeped in blood. It's reminds me of violent dispossession of my people.
Why are we having this on this date, if this is the date that's upsetting so many people?
The date is a painful one for Indigenous Australians because it marks the first arrival of British settlers in 1788 and recalls past and present traumas of repression, loss, exclusion and inequality. Aboriginal people were only legally counted as being Australian as late as 1967. Some think the day should be abolished entirely. Others argue for a change in the date. The view of the current government is that by changing the date of Australia Day, you're just denying history. But the bigger question is, who decides whose history should be celebrated? Well, I'm joined now by Douglas Murray, who has written about this issue in Australia in his latest book, The Strange Death of Europe, and from Melbourne by the activist and actor Nakia Louie, a young leader within the Australian Aboriginal community. Good evening to you both. Douglas Murray, isn't it time to change Australia Day?
Well, I think a lot of Australians will wonder why and will see it as being an assault on something very foundational about their nation, and indeed it is. I mean, there's all sorts of arguments to be had about history. Nobody would or could deny the treatment and the mistreatment and maltreatment of the Aboriginal peoples. But the problem here is that, as so often, the question is whether you're dealing with critics or enemies. And a lot of Australians will have heard the organiser of the protests on their national holiday talking not just about the invasion of Australia, but saying, F Australia, I hope it burns to the ground. Now, that is not the language of a critic of a country. That is somebody who's talking as an enemy. And that sort of talk is...
Isn't that somebody who's perhaps kind of, in the end, so frustrated by the kind of, as it were, the kind of denial?
But Australia hasn't got denial about this. Australia has had national sorry days. They've had national signings of books to say sorry, all sorts of things. Australia hasn't ignored its past.
Nakia, what do you say to that Australia has not ignored its past?
Well, I think that Douglas Murray is operating on a few false premises there. The Australian Institute recently did a study which said that the majority of Australians don't care what day Australia Day is on. So if a day that's meant to celebrate and unify the country is on a date that is dividing us, I think then we need to examine the values that we're celebrating. And you speak of that there is no denial of the history of the past of Australia. Well, there actually is, and that's one of the things why we're protesting, is that we're having our national celebrations on a day, January 26, which represents the day Captain Cook put that Union Jack in the ground in Australia and declared it sovereign, which began colonisation, which resulted in genocides, over 500 massacres just on the east coast of Australia alone, up to 90% of the Aboriginal population wiped out, and that continued well into 1967, where my parents weren't considered Australian citizens. So there is a denial when you have your national day on a day that represents such brutality.
Isn't there a situation where you can say we live in a new modern Australia made up of all sorts of peoples, and so therefore we should create something new?
Well, Australia, again, has been having this discussion for decades now. This is not a new discussion.
But then there's a new generation coming up.
Sure, but what is striking about it, as I say, first of all, is the tone of the attack on Australia Day, the tone of burn this country to the ground, which is, I think we could all agree, across any...
That is incorrect. That is incorrect. That is incorrect. It's not about an attack on Australia Day. It's about changing the date. This is about all Australians.
Said that. She did say that.
But this is one person. I want to actually come back to you.
The organiser.
What about Douglas? By you highlighting that, which is it's a political playing card.
But she's the organiser of the so-called Invasion Day. I mean, that is important. She wasn't just the
organiser of the so-called Invasion Day, and she has said that her comments were taken out of context.
No, she has refused to apologise. She said that she said
please let me finish my sentence. This is no longer a British colony. I'm a person who lives in this community.
I want to ask you about this historical hurt. I mean, how deep does it go, for example, for your generation?
Well, it continues on to this day, and that's the issue, is that the oppression of colonisation has made Aboriginal people very vulnerable. Our life disparity...
Do you feel growing up, did you feel vulnerable growing up? Did it affect you on a daily basis?
Well, our life expectancy is 20 years below that of a non-Aboriginal Australian. Incarceration rates are much higher. The majority of Aboriginal people live in poverty. So yes, it did affect me growing up. I was someone who lived in a housing commission home. I was someone whose grandparents and parents were... my grandparents were afraid of my parents being stolen and having the children taken away.
Well, let me just...
that's something that continues through generations. You get caught in Abo.
Let me just put this to Douglas. You're in favour of, as it were, the first nation in a country having a sort of special status. So, for example, in the UK, you want to celebrate that here. If the nation is the first nation, is an Indigenous nation in Australia, surely it should have a special celebration.
Sure, and they do, and that happens.
No, but a primary one, because they are the first people of that country.
I think what it's worth seeing is in a wider context. This very similar thing is happening in America, has happened in Canada, and basically this movement, which Australia is part of as well, is there is a movement of people who say everywhere the Europeans went, they've colonised, they've destroyed, they've wrecked, and I think we can have a sensible weighing up of the historical discussion without, if I can say so, saying that the Europeans are colonists, the Europeans are genocidists, the Europeans are still guilty, the Europeans have to keep on...
But they were colonists, that's just a fact,
yes,
they were colonists.
But the question keeps on coming down to this question as well as historical guilt and the appropriate weighing up of history. And that we hadn't had that in the past in Australia, we don't get it with the Burn Australia Down stuff either.
Well, thank you both very much indeed.